This week on the show is the Tibetan issue, a landmass that's almost 25% of China. 25% of that is actually Tibet, annexed by Mao Zedong a year after he founded the People's Republic of China in 1949. The fault line that runs deep in the region has once again been brought to fore by the issue of succession, with His Holiness making it clear that the tradition of Tibetan Buddhists having a Dalai Lama will continue, and that the 15th Dalai Lama will be chosen by Tibetans, not by the Chinese Communist Party. Viewers, since 1950, this region has been under the Chinese occupation, under Chinese control, complete subjugation. This report tells you why the fight for the Tibetan soul is far from over and why Beijing is getting sleepless nights over who gets to decide the 15th Dalai Lama. Take a look.
A spiritual battle with geopolitical consequences as the Dalai Lama firmly rejects China's authority over his reincarnation. In a rare and bold move, the Tibetan spiritual leader has dismissed China's claim to control his reincarnation. A centuries-old Tibetan tradition is now at the center of a modern geopolitical storm. And this storm could redraw spiritual borders and reignite old wounds between India and China. The tensions began in 1950. The People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, calling it a peaceful liberation. But for Tibetans, it was the beginning of an occupation. In 1959, amid a failed uprising, the Dalai Lama fled to India, finding refuge in Dharamshala. Since then, China has tightened its grip on the region, suppressing Tibetan culture, language, and religion. And now China wants to control the future of Tibetan Buddhism itself. Beijing insists the next Dalai Lama must be born in China and approved by the Communist Party. Many questions are being asked. Could there be two Dalai Lamas in the future, one recognized by Tibetans in exile and another anointed by Beijing? Analysts warn this spiritual rift could spark a legitimacy crisis, and the ripple effects could reach Indian shores. Experts suggest that Tibetan exiles in India offer a leverage and buffer to India vis-à-vis China's influence in the Himalayan region. A divided Dalai Lama would test that balance. Two Dalai Lamas, one a symbol of resilience and exile, the other a product of Chinese power projection. As this spiritual succession turns political, India finds itself in the eye of an ancient and escalating storm. This is no ordinary reincarnation. This is a new flashpoint in the India-China rivalry. Bureau Report for NDTV World.
So this is the history of this entire issue. But why is it that China actually wants to have its own Dalai Lama? Why does it matter so much? Let's explain that, because that tells you the deepest fault line that runs in that region. Why is it that China wants to appoint the 15th Dalai Lama? First, a pliable Dalai Lama will not ask for autonomy. As I said, 25% of Chinese landmass is actually Tibet, something that has been under subjugation of Chinese control since 1950. And since then, call for autonomy, self-governance haven't ended. A pliable Dalai Lama would mean an end to that completely. Second, no demand for separate Tibetan identity. Tibetan culture, Tibetan identity, Tibetan language, all of that, the urge to preserve it, to ensure that that remains as it is still there. But a Dalai Lama that is completely aligned to the CCP will not have any such inclination whatsoever, and that erasure of Tibetan identity will be so important for the CCP. And this is something that could be from a language point of view, food, culture, libraries, all of which, a large part of that, remember, was stamped out during the Cultural Revolution in China and during the 60s, the decade-long Cultural Revolution, but a lot of that still remains, which is why China wants to have its own Dalai Lama. The other part, it will be seen, that Dalai Lama will be seen as a CCP agent. He will be an extension of the thought process of the Chinese Communist Party, and that will mean that a large part of the Tibetan separatist movement that the CCP views is going to end on its own, which is why this is so important. And lastly, it will not, the Dalai Lama that will be anointed by the Communist Party of China will not have the authority to actually mobilize and teach Tibetans anything about their spirituality. So this figure will not stand tall amongst Tibetan Buddhists around the world, which is why it is so important for China to actually appoint. And they've done so. They've done so in the past, twice the Panchen Lamas that were appointed, but then that have been rejected by Buddhists and Tibetan Buddhists around the world. But that is a call that China wants to do all over again, and which is why we pointed out why this is so important. Now viewers, the bottom line as far as this issue is concerned is that choosing the next Dalai Lama is not just about the next spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. It is much more than that. Dalai Lama is the guide, philosopher, or bodhisattva of the Tibetan people. Bodhisattva is the one who is an epitome of compassion, knowledge, and spirituality, fountainhead of their thought, someone whose word can and does rally Tibetans world over. And it is this scenario that China is most worried about. 3 generations of Tibetans have lived in exile, many of them in India and elsewhere, with most having little expectations that their land will once again become theirs. But what many still harbor is the thought of having some sort of self-governance, some autonomy, something that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to stamp out with brutal force till now. A 15th Dalai Lama that is young, dynamic, and a fiery orator will be able to create a momentum that will make the CCP look weak. And that is the big fear in Chongnanhai. Well, as for India, it houses the largest number of Tibetans outside of Tibet, and the Tibetan government in exile, working since 1960, that was recognized by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And that's a leverage that Beijing knows only too well that India has and retains over it as far as the Himalayan region is concerned. All right, viewers, that brings us to the end of this edition of Faultlines. Thanks so much for watching. We come back next week with another edition telling you once again the fault lines that exist around the world. Thanks so much for watching this episode.